Back when I was in high school, a friend of my mom's asked if I wanted to babysit their kid for a few hours. They offered a generous rate of pay, then after I proved myself capable, they asked if I'd be interested in babysitting for a friend of theirs. I said sure. They gave me a number to call, then once we'd made arrangements for me to babysit for them, they gave me their address. They lived out in East Hampton, about 45 minutes drive from my home in Medford. As soon as my mom found out, she said something like, "East Hampton, huh? That's a real fancy place." So I kind of knew what to expect before I got there. But when I actually saw the house for myself, I was blown away. Their house was basically 3 of my mom's houses put together, with a gigantic backyard, a huge pool, and even a giant chessboard with pieces half my size. The inside looked like the sitting room set from The Fresh Prince, with a cream color scheme and a wood paneling giving the place a very distinct air of class. The kids' mom and dad were very warm and welcoming, and when they introduced me to their 9-year-old daughter, all my reservations instantly evaporated. Instead of some bratty rich kid, Angie was just as delightful as her parents, and I knew from the moment that I met her that we'd get along very well. She wasn't too demanding and was content to just watch a movie or two until she got too tired to keep her eyes open. We'd order pizza, watch some tapes, eat a ton of ice cream, then I'd either chill out or work on some homework until Angie's parents came back from wherever they'd spent the evening. Sometimes it felt almost criminal just taking that money. They paid my gas money, paid for the pizza. They even made sure the fridge and pantry were all stocked in case I got hungry after Angie's dinner time. Then, with the family home being as incredible as it was, it fast became my favorite sitting job. Now cut to Friday, October 16th of 1992, and the family in East Hampton had arranged for me to come over for what'd be my 5th time sitting for them. I drove over after school, arrived at around 4:30, then Angie's parents left for dinner at around 5. We ordered pizza, did each other's hair while we watched TV, then broke out the crumb cake at around 7. We were still finishing our slices when the phone rang, and upon hearing it, Angie spins around and asks me if she can be the one to answer it. Her parents sometimes called just to check in on us, and I figured that there was no harm letting her pick up the phone, and so I said, sure, why not? Angie ran off to pick up the phone, and I stayed put, eating my cake. The phone was mounted to the wall dividing the sitting room and the kitchen, so I could still see and hear Angie as she ran over towards it. She reached up on her tiptoes, grabbed the handset, and in a way that was so adorable it almost hurt, she says, "Hello, you've reached the residence. How may I take your call?" And I watched her with this big, proud smile on my face, but following her grand introduction, a confused look came across Angie's face before she asked, "Hello?" for a second time. There was another pause, and then she turned, raised the phone up, and told me, "There's no one there." I put down my cake and then got up and walked over to her. She needed help returning the handset to its cradle anyways, so I took the phone from her, put it to my ear, then heard the sound of a dead line. I told her it was probably just a wrong number or something, and then we went back to finish off our cake, but not 10 minutes later, the phone rang a second time. That time, I got up to answer it, and when I did, I'm guessing I heard the same thing Angie did. I picked up the handset and asked, "Hello?" and then got nothing in reply. I asked hello again, then after another pause, I heard the distinct sound of someone hanging up a phone, like that old plastic rattling before the line goes dead. I remember that exact moment, that feeling of confusion shifting to one of creeping dread. And that made it 2 silent calls in just over 10 minutes, and I'd seen enough cheap thrillers to know that that wasn't a sign that anything good was about to happen. I just didn't think that it had anything to do with the family I was babysitting for. I thought that it was all about me. And yes, I phrased that in a deliberately egotistical fashion, but only to reflect on how stupid and self-centered I felt afterwards, because due to the very severe limitations of my 17-year-old mind, I became transfixed on the idea that it was a guy from high school that had been bugging me around that time. He'd slid notes into my locker at school, asked my friends to pass on please to call him, or my least favorite, wait for me outside the girls' bathroom before basically cornering me on the way out. He'd also somehow managed to get a hold of my home phone number at one point, and he'd called my house one time, asked my dad if he could speak to me, and then said nothing for like the first 10 seconds once I'd been handed the phone. But the worst thing was, my mom and dad thought that it was cute. It didn't seem to bother them much that his attention was completely unsolicited. Their solution was, ask him to leave you alone. And then when I told them that I'd already tried that, it was, well, ask him again. And that's why when I realized that there were silent calls, my first suspicion was that my unwanted Romeo had somehow gotten a hold of the family's home phone number. And I was too busy trying to figure out how that could happen to consider any other more frightening possibilities. Angie asked who was calling, so I lied for a second time and told her that it must have been a wrong number. She might have been one of the sweetest girls I'd ever babysat, but Angie was not gullible, and was vocally confused as to why someone would call the wrong number twice. I made an on-the-spot joke about them having pudgy fingers or something, which served as just enough of a distraction to get Angie's thoughts off of the silent calls. I didn't think my stalker, and I use that term very loosely, had the stones to actually show up to the house. He seemed to be more about opportunity than anything else. But it was still a lingering concern for me, and one I didn't want to pass on to little old Angie. Another hour or so went by, and we were fast approaching Angie's extended bedtime of 10 p.m., our little secret. I asked if she wanted one last soda, diet of course, with no caffeine and no zoomies, and then walked into the kitchen to get us some drinks. The layout of the house was such that the kitchen led to a dining room via a set of double doors, with the dining room windows allowing a view of the driveway outside. When I walked past the doors the first time, empty-handed, everything seemed perfectly normal. But when walking past it a second time, with a can of soda in each hand, I saw the headlights of a car shining down the driveway. The family had sort of an intercom at their automatic gate, and if you didn't have the little key card or the code or whatever it might be, you had to be buzzed in to even get access to the driveway. The car was stationary, its front bumper pointed at the gate, but the intercom in the house wasn't buzzing. My first thought was, maybe I just caught the car turning around, but nope. It stayed put like it was waiting for the gate to open. Then I figured it was Angie's parents arriving home early and that, I don't know, maybe they lost their keycard or something. I walked into the dining room to get a closer look out of the window, studying the headlights as the car idled by the gate. And then suddenly, silhouetted by the car's headlights, I saw 3 or 4 men climb over the gate before they began walking down the driveway at a very brisk pace. I remember the feeling, this rising panic as I put down the sodas on the ledge near the window, and then walked toward the phone as quickly as I could. I remember grabbing the handset and trying not to sound too panicked as I loudly asked Angie to head upstairs. This was like a whole hour before her promised bedtime, so she was very naturally dismayed at the sudden change of plans and began asking me why. I told her to be a good girl and do as I asked, before putting the phone's handset to my ear. I thought that I might hear the 911 person's voice, or, at worst, the last few dials before one answered my call. But instead, I heard nothing. I remember pushing the little switch to reset the phone, expecting the drone of an open line to return, but I did it once, twice, and then 3 times before I realized that the line was dead. I didn't know it at the time. I thought that I'd simply experienced an astronomical amount of bad luck in having the phone die on me when I needed it most. But it hadn't died. There had been no kind of malfunction. Someone had cut the home's phone line to ensure that no emergency calls could be made. I knew the family had a second phone in the master bedroom, so after taking Angie's hand, I quickly walked us up the stairs and toward the bedroom door. And by then, Angie had begun to sense how frightened I was, and she kept asking what was going on, her terror intensifying each time I let the question go unanswered. We walked into the bedroom, and when I heard no sound at all coming from the handset of the second phone, that's when I realized something much worse was happening. I know having a bunch of guys climbing a gate and rushing the house was bad enough, but the phone line being dead suggested a very chilling degree of organization from these guys. Those guys were not your average home invaders, if there is such a thing, and realizing that brought a level of terror that I can only barely describe. And by then, there was no hiding my fear anymore. Angie was demanding to know what was going on, and I couldn't think of a lie quick enough, so I just told her the truth. I told her that there were some bad men outside, and that they most likely wanted to break into the house and that we needed to find some place to hide from them. And I'll never forget how completely petrified Angie looked in the seconds after those words left my lips. And I still beat myself up about it all these years later, but in the moment, there was nothing else I could think of. I was 17, scared out of my mind, and Angie knew her home better than I ever could. I was reliant on her to be able to find the best hiding place possible, and that transfer of responsibility terrified us both. Right then on cue, we each heard a loud doll hammering sound coming from downstairs as the men outside started to try and break in. Angie screamed, and I remember grabbing each of her arms before shushing her. I tried to be gentle, trying to keep her as calm as possible. Then I asked her where the best hiding place in the house was. There was like a voice in my head in the moments after I asked her, one that screamed at me, how the hell is she supposed to know? She's just a little girl. An innocent little girl that you are failing to protect. I still feel, almost, at least in principle, that voice was right in the milliseconds that it popped into my mind. A girl Angie's age probably thought the back of her closet was another dimension, or that the space under her bed would be sufficient to hide us both from violent criminals. But in reality, Angie knew the perfect place to hide, and it was nowhere I could have ever taken her. After I asked her about the best place to hide, Angie thought for a moment, and then took me by the hand and started leading me towards the home's 3rd floor. When we got to the top of the stairs, there were 3 doors in front of us, 2 of which clearly led to larger rooms and one smaller door that turned out to be a closet. Angie took us to the closet. When she opened the door, I saw shelves on either side filled with boxes of old junk, along with a bookcase against the rear wall. I remember telling Angie that we needed somewhere bigger, someplace the bad men wouldn't see us if they came and opened the door. I spoke, but it was like Angie didn't hear me. She ran over to the bookcase and reached to the back of one of the lowest shelves like she was about to retrieve a book. I was halfway telling her that this wasn't the time for reading when I heard a loud click coming from behind the bookcase. I knew in an instant what Angie just did, but that didn't stop my jaw from hitting the floor when she used all of her strength to pull the bookcase away from the rear wall. The only reason that she could do so with the strength of a 9-year-old was that the bookcase was actually mounted on a huge set of hinges, and behind it was a short, downward leading staircase. It was weird feeling almost amazed, but at the same time I didn't feel surprised at all. Of course they had a safe room, and of course they told their 9-year-old daughter how to access it in case of emergencies. But what really did surprise me was just how well this safe room was decked out and how Angie's demeanor shifted completely once the door was closed behind us. I remember how she reached up and flicked on a light switch that illuminated the stairs in front of us, and then after taking a few steps downward, she turned and told me to close the door. I followed her downstairs after doing so and was greeted with the first of 2 rooms. That one was basically a small sitting area, complete with bookshelves, a TV and VHS combo, with some snacks and bottles of water stacked in one corner. The next room, however, was essentially some kind of command center. There was a wall of TV monitors, all linked up to security cameras in each room, with an attached panel of switches that meant that you could both see and hear what was going on in the house. But the most important, and possibly the most impressive thing, was that this command center had a working phone. I don't know if it was hooked up to a satellite or a hidden alternate phone line, but when I picked it up and heard a working dial tone, I almost burst into tears from the sheer relief that I felt. And I called the cops. I told them everything, but it didn't make Angie feel any safer. She felt safe the second the door closed behind us, and after announcing that the bad men couldn't find us in there, she went about deciding what VHS tape that she wanted to watch until the bad men had gone away. It got to the point where I couldn't decide if she was the bravest little girl I'd ever met, or this was something that had happened before. Once I was done talking to the authorities and then telling Angie that the cops were on their way, I asked if this was something that had happened prior, and she said no, but that her mom and dad had shown her what to do in case any bad men came to the house. She then put on a VHS tape and sort of settled herself down on the couch opposite the TV and asked me, "Do I still gotta go to bed at 10 p.m.? And the question alone almost knocked me off my feet. But once I'd regained what little composure I had, I told her no, that she didn't have to go to bed at 10, and that she was probably about to have her latest night ever. It was incredible, really, seeing a little girl acting calmer and more collected than myself in the middle of a crisis. But like Angie said, she knew the drill, and I guess that knowledge dispelled any fear of the chaos unfolding downstairs. But not only was it chaotic, what I heard over the monitors scared the living hell out of me. I remember walking back into the little control room or command center as I referred to it before and taking a moment to study the little switch panel. It wasn't hard to work out how to switch the monitors on, and it wasn't hard to switch audio feeds either, but listening to what those men were saying down there made for some extremely difficult listening. I expected to see them looting the first floor, grabbing all the various electronics before running back down the driveway to load up their vehicle. But that's not what I saw when I switched on those monitors. They weren't looking for expensive goods to steal. They were looking for what I can only assume to be Angie. I realized before I heard anyone talking, because none of the four masked men seemed in the least bit interested in the huge TV and lavish stereo system that was in the living room. They were going from room to room, opening up closets and looking under beds, and then moments later, I managed to catch two of them talking to one another in the same bedroom that we'd been in just minutes before. One of them asked something like, "Where the hell is she?" before the other told him, "I heard her voice." And I was frozen, thinking about what might have been happening to us at that moment if Angie hadn't taken us to this safe room. And I carried on watching the men downstairs, waiting for the cops to show up until there was suddenly a whole bunch of commotion from them, presumably after they'd heard the sirens coming from the street outside. And after that, that's when those men ran. And finally, when I could see only uniformed officers walking calmly into the rooms downstairs, I opened up that safe room door and then told Angie to stay on the couch while I went to talk to the cops. And that was the one time she openly disobeyed me, and I can't say that I was mad in the moment. She just wanted to say hi to the people who had come to rescue us. It made for a very cute ending to what had been the most terrifying experience of my whole short life at that point, and to be honest, nothing has ever really topped it in the terms of sheer terror that I felt. Not to mention that skin-crawling feeling of knowing those men were after this girl that I was watching, and not just money or jewelry. The officers were then able to contact Angie's parents because they'd left the address of where they'd be that evening, and they were back home and hugging their daughter within a half hour of the cops first arriving. The police managed to catch the driver of that car, but he claimed to be just some getaway driver and had no idea what the others were planning. The others, though, were never caught, but the security cameras recorded what they'd said about looking for the girl, and by the girl they almost certainly meant Angie. And Angie's parents thanked me for saving their daughter, and I had to actually sit them down and explain that I didn't do anything. It was actually Angie, the little girl that had saved the both of us. I'd done nothing but tell her about the guys breaking in. They said that they'd understand if I didn't want to babysit for Angie anymore, but all it took was the thank you letter that she sent to convince me that I had to stay. I mean, it definitely sweetened the deal that they promised to hire armed security in the future, would basically meant that Angie had a second, much more intimidating babysitter, but there was no way that I could just turn my back on her. And I guess that makes me sound a little crazy, but that's honestly how I felt. My love for that girl and her family overrode any fear of a repeat home invasion. And besides, if it did happen again, I knew exactly what to do to keep her safe from the maniacs who wanted to kidnap her. I grew up in a place called Alice Springs in Australia's Northern Territory. It's got a reputation for being pretty rough, and deservedly so. It's got one of the highest crime rates in all of Australia, and things got so bad last year that the government banned alcohol sales and started introducing nighttime curfews. I moved away years back, so I couldn't tell you if it's actually as bad as it sounds, but here's a little story from back when I was a lad that'll give you an idea of what it was like back then. Just after I turned 20, I got a job working as an overnight security guard at a local youth center. They needed people to watch the place overnight, as the place had all kinds of televisions, stereos, and video games that the local scumbags were itching to get their hands on. I did 5 nights a week, usually with a veteran named Simon, and some nights he'd order some dimmies from the Chinese place around the corner, then send me over to pick them up. I'd grab them, then sometimes a few bottles from the bottle shop next door. Nothing too strong, but perks of working overnight, you know? Anyway, one night he sends me around to grab the dimmies, and it's a proper stinker of a night, so I'm dying for a bottle of Coke or something, so I nibbed into the bottle shop at around 10, like I normally would. I walked in, and there's no one at the counter, but it's as quiet as a mouse in church as well, so I don't see or hear anything amiss. But then as I walk down one of the shop's aisles and then come out the bottom near the fridges, I suddenly see someone who'd been previously hidden from view. I remember him having long, copper-red hair, but worn in like a bun on the top of his head. He was shirtless and had khaki shorts and slides on too, but his chest and stomach were covered in the milk that he was swigging like he was dying of thirst. He's got this massive carton of it in one hand, and he's just chugging it all non-stop, but then in his other hand, he held a hammer, and that hand was glistening with someone's blood. It sounds a bit daft to say it, but it was such an unexpected sight that I couldn't help blurt out, "F me," as I turned back around to walk out of the shop. But the next thing I heard was, "What you saying, you effing dog?" It was right near the door when I turned my head to look behind me, and all I saw was the shirtless bloke with the hammer coming at me with his chest and beard still soaked with milk. The door was one of those heavy ones that you gotta pull on the way out, but that meant that I couldn't just fluidly slip out of the door, you know? I had to stop and pull it back on myself as the bloke was coming at me, and I realized in a split second that if I tried to slip around it, he'd have a perfect shot on me with that hammer. And so instead of doing that, I pushed myself back away from the door as quick as I could to throw him off. Thankfully that worked, and he sent that hammer smashing through the glass panel of the door with this really loud crash, but it also left me with no obvious route of escape. I did the only thing I could think of at the time, which was to launch myself over the shop's counter. And thank F that they didn't have all the plexiglass shields like they do now, or I'd have been royally screwed. But I managed to make it over to the other side just in time to hear this great bloody smash behind me. I'm guessing the bloke threw the hammer at me once I'd made it over the counter, and that smashed some of the bottles of grog behind me. Not that I stopped to look and make sure, I just kept on running into the back of the shop and hoping that I could find a way out. Whoever was in the shop when the hammer bloke walked in must have just scarpered out the back doors, because they were still wide open as I came running through and out into the back alley. And as I ran out, I saw this little Indian bloke on the phone with the cops, but he saw me and thought that I was the bloke because the second he saw me, he raises this massive kitchen knife into the air, which has me screaming, "Hold your bloody horses, mate, I'm on your side." And luckily for me, he very quickly realized I wasn't the hammerman and starts apologizing for almost shanking me. But I'm still like, no time for chat, Cobber, he's still chasing me. And we ran like clappers down the alleyway till we got to the main road, and by then, it was clear that the hammer bloke had no intention of chasing us down that alleyway, thankfully. It turns out, Hammerman had walked into the shop, shirtless when he got there, and went straight for the milk fridge to help himself. The shopkeeper said another customer had said something to him about not just helping himself, and then whack. The Hammerman had bloody well smashed him one right in that face. And the shopkeep then started shouting about calling the police, but the Hammerman didn't take that too kindly and charged that guy, causing him to run out the back, which is where I found him. The little Indian guy was asking if the Hammerman had hit me at all, and I was telling him, no, I'm all right, when we saw the cops coming down the road quite fast. And the Indian bloke and I then walked around the corner to watch the street theater unfold, and we turned onto the street in question just as the cops are approaching the shop, one with a gun out and the other with a stun gun. We obviously stayed back, and the shop runner guy says something like, "Oh God, he's going to smash my shop," because we could hear the Hammerman inside going bloody mental. But when we actually got a good look inside, through the glass windows, we saw that the situation inside had taken a dramatic turn for the worse. The Hammerman was standing just inside the doorway, brandishing that hammer, shouting something like, I'll smash him," at the cops as they shouted back, "Put the hammer down now." But at his feet, there was another bloke. Bald head, all bloody, totally unconscious looking, and it's him that the Hammerman is threatening to smash. I'm assuming someone else must have walked into that shop after me, and I just remember saying to that guy, "I'd look away if I were you, mate," and I did the same because someone was about to either get shot or bashed in the head. And the Indian bloke just kept looking through, and right as the shouting got a bit louder behind us, bang, 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 and down went the Hammerman. I felt awful for the bloke, and I still do. He'd come all the way to Australia to open himself a little shop, and then ended up having some mad bastard come in to steal his milk and smash his customers. That'd be bad enough for anyone, but to have the bloke shot and killed in his shop, that's something he'll have to revisit again and again, every time he steps on the spot where it happened. But that should also give you an idea of how crazy Alice Springs was and is, and why these days you can't legally purchase alcohol if you're from what they call a town camp, which is basically the government's subsidized housing. So, after hearing all of that, you can understand why I laugh when people ask me why I moved away. Many years ago, a lifetime ago it really seems, I used to work as a bouncer on doors at pubs and clubs in Newcastle city centre. It had quite a rough upbringing, and the school playground could be a violent place. And so for a lot of young lads like me, who weren't particularly big or strong, you had to learn to fight if you wanted people to leave you alone. And the place to learn to fight was the local boxing gym. I started training twice after school on weekdays, then every Saturday morning for a full 4 hours, and I loved every second of it. I made good friends, learned how to defend myself, and it instilled two very valuable traits in me: discipline and respect, both of which have served me very well over the years. By the time I was 18, I was lined up for a few actual organized fights. But with me still being an amateur, I wasn't making any money off of it, and that's where Graham stepped in. Graham was a mate of the boxing gym's owner, and seeing as he did a lot of boxing in his youth, he'd pop down to the gym every so often to see some of the lads train. But he wasn't just there to watch them train. He was headhunting for lads to come and work for his door firm, and one Saturday morning, I managed to catch his attention. He told me to show up to a club in the city center at midnight for a trial shift, and if I could handle myself, then I could expect to be working every weekend from then on. It was a little bit of a I'm not asking, I'm telling kind of deal, but the money was so good that no one ever turned him down. I'm pretty sure no wasn't a word Graham was used to hearing very often, we'll put it that way. And so that's how I started working the doors around Newcastle from age 18 onward, and by the time I was 25, I had graduated from the early doors pubs and clubs to the late night gaffs that got proper leery after about 1 or 2 in the morning, and these places were on another level. When I first started, There'd be two of you working a Saturday night in a single floor pub, but by the time I was trusted to work the bigger jobs, you were looking at 2, 3, sometimes 4 floor nightclubs that could fit hundreds and hundreds of punters. But with the bigger jobs came bigger money, and if you managed to get the one particular job that I got, that will go unnamed for legal reasons, then you made absolute megabucks. And that's because on top of your normal taxable pay, you got your exes, or extras, which is what you were paid to look the other way for the dealers Graham allowed into the club. This was at the time when ecstasy tablets had first hit the Northeast, and when it did, it hit big. Times were hard for people growing up back then, as most of the shipping jobs were gone, so having happiness in tablet form sweep through town, it was like everybody wanted a bit. And since everybody wanted a bit, the money people were making was off the scale. Dealers were getting into clubs with a few hundred tablets, then walking out with 1,500 pounds. Then they go to the next club and do it all over again, and again, and again, and again. There was money going around like you wouldn't believe, and the only thing standing between the dealers and all that cash were us doormen. I suppose at some point, it came down to a choice. Act like complete saints, refuse to partake in any of it, and settle for your hard-earned wage, or make 200 more pounds every single night just for looking the other way with one single solitary dealer. Times that by 2 or 3, and you're walking away with more money in exes than you did from your normal wage. And were we declaring any of it to the tax man? Were we bollocks? Things stayed sweet like that for a while, and we had a really good go of it. But the more money people generated, the more people wanted in on the action. We started having loads of young lads, all of them unauthorized, trying to sneak bags of tablets past us to make a few £100 without us taxing them. At first, we just confiscated their gear, gave them a slap, and then sent them on their way. But the problem wouldn't stop, and that's when Graham passed down the order to make an example of someone, and so that's exactly what we did. We took this one lad, we'll call him Sparky, who we dealt with a couple of times before, and we kicked 7 shades of shite out of him round the back of the club one night, all on Graham's orders. It was just to make an example out of him. It wasn't anything personal, but since he ended up in hospital, Sparky took it personal. About 2 weeks after, a bloke I worked with called Ronnie walked out of his gym, got into the driver's seat of his car, and was about to drive home when someone tapped on his window. Ronnie turned his head to look, and bang, someone shot him in the face. And by some stroke of miraculous good luck, Ronnie survived his brush with death because the bullet went through his eye, then out the side of his head, totally missing his brain and spine and all of that. And we were made up to hear that he'd be okay, but the message was a clear one. Ronnie had been one of the fellas to give Sparky a kicking, and when we heard Sparky was nowhere to be found, we had a pretty good idea that it was him. But without knowing where he was, we were all vulnerable. He could walk up to any door in a crowd of people, wearing a baseball cap and sunglasses or something, and just boom. That'd be us rubbed out. But as you can imagine, this had us properly on our toes for the next 2 weeks or so, and the worst thing was, we couldn't even be certain that it was Sparky that we had to be on the lookout for. Graham had been the go-between from the police to Ronnie's family and us, but as much as he had been pestering the police for info, they told him that they had no idea who the shooter might have been, nor did they have any idea where Sparky was. But Graham didn't believe them. He thought that they were treating us like mushrooms, feeding us shite and keeping us in the dark because God knows if we'd have figured out where Sparky was, he'd have been a dead man for what he'd done to Ronnie. But then that meant that we had no idea if or when he was coming for us, and I'd never seen so many big hard blokes acting so scared for their lives. Graham told us all that he was trying to get hold of some bulletproof vests, and that our door would be the first to get them when he did. But till then, we had to just sit tight, hope Sparky showed up somewhere, and keep our heads on a swivel when we were at work. 2 weeks after Ronnie was shot, we were all still proper on edge, but the more time that went by, we started to think maybe Sparky had run off to the Costa del Sol after shooting Ronnie, and most definitely thinking he'd killed him. And if that was the case, then we had nothing to worry about, and we might never see Sparky ever again. but there was still that worry that he was just biding his time, waiting until we'd let our guards down a bit to strike, and that's why we could never properly relax. And so that Saturday night, a fortnight after Ronnie was rushed to hospital, a group of 5 of us were working the doors of the unnamed nightclub, and 3 of us had been involved in Sparky's beating, so we were proper on edge and watching the street for any signs of him and his boys. Suddenly, I hear one of the lads saying, "Why, hey man, who's this here then?" And he's looking down the street at someone, so I walk over to see who he's looking at, and we both see this kid walking down the street towards us. He looks to be about 14 or 15, 5'3" with a little teenage tash above his lip, and he walks right past us and towards the doors of the club. The boss doorman was like, "Where the bloody hell do you think you're going, young man?" And the kid says, "Inside." And the boss asks him, "And how old are you then?" And when he replies, 18, we all burst out laughing. The boss tells the lad, "If you're 18, then I'm Bobby Charlton. I'll bugger off before I give you a slap." And this wee lad just walks off in a huff, but we thought that he was brilliant because he'd really lighten the mood. And this was about 11:30, something like that, and we were all saying, "I wish something like that happened every night." But then about an hour later, it did. We get the nod that there's a kid in the club and that he's trying to sell tablets to the punters, and the boss sends 2 door staff down into the club, and who do they drag out but the kid that we'd just given the knockback to not an hour earlier. He's kicking and screaming, and the 2 lads are carrying him out with a hand under each arm, so his little legs are actually flailing around as they're carrying him. And we laughed so hard that I thought it was about to blow a gasket, and off the young lad went for a second time, huffing and puffing, but before he went, the kid shouted back, "I'm gonna back with a gun, and I'm gonna blow all your heads off." And we were just about rolling around on the floor after he said that. This pint-sized gangster threatening to slot us when he probably had school in the morning. And so, we just waved him away after telling him to come back next week for another laugh. Once all the laughter had died down, we asked to the 2 lads who went in to get him how the kid had gotten into the club in the first place, and they said the sneaky little bugger must have slipped into one of the back doors when one of the club's staff took a bottle bin out to empty. You had to admire it, the gumption to do something like that. But then the 2 lads told us the kid actually did have a little bag of tablets on him. And they weren't fakes either. He wasn't trying to flog indigestion tablets as ecstasies. They were legit, and they all had the little smiley face or bat signal designs on them. There was only about 10 in the bag, but it got us thinking, where's this wee lad got tablets from? And there's no way anyone would be so daft as to send a child into an over-18s bar. And you might as well just turn yourself into a police station. So how's he got his hands on them? But it's also not like we had time to wrestle with the question. We had a job to do. And for the next few hours when things were at their most hectic, we were occupied trying to keep order in the club. By about 3 in the morning, the busiest part of the night was over, and although it was still bumping in the club downstairs, the crowds were starting to thin out and people were starting to flag taxis down to make their way home. I couldn't wait to get home and get a shower. I'd had to turf about 5 people out that night, and I'd had drinks spilled all over me in the process. My shirt stank of beer and alcopops, and I'm just trying to run down the clock until I can call it a night. But then about half an hour from closing, who comes walking down the street but the Newcastle kid? Or at least that's what one of the lads christened him as he come walking up the street towards us. And we're all laughing, saying things like, "Oh, here he comes. He's about to pull out a shooter and start blasting." And then, when he gets within about 10 to 15 feet of us, he pulls out this big cowboy-looking pistol from his pants and points it right at us. It didn't look real. It was dull-looking, and it looked like the handle was coming off, like this wee lad had pulled the orange cap off of a toy gun and brought it down to the club to brandish it at us. We're just about falling all over the place, singing themes from old westerns like it's a showdown at high noon and all that. We'd been that tense over the past 2 weeks that it was just this big release of tension, I think. I mean, we were dying laughing at the wee lad, Now, for a bit of context, there was a lot of gangsters using guns at the time, like our old mate Sparky, for example, but that in turn had some unexpected consequences. Because everyone was hearing about all this gun crime, everyone was terrified of one pointed at them. So what robbers and other unsavory types started doing was bringing toy guns to robberies. All they had to do was flash their toy guns, or sometimes just point to a lump in their jacket like "that's a gun, that is, now hand over the cash," and the terrified cashier would do just that. It became a bit of a thing in Newcastle at the time. So when we saw that kid pull that old, falling-apart cowboy gun out in that poorly lit street and thought, there's not a cat in hell's chance that that's a real gun. But then, the kid pulled back the hammer of the gun, the clicky thing that they do in the movies, you know the one, and we knew toy guns did not do that. There was this moment of silence after we heard it, as everyone had this collective moment of thinking, oh bollocks. And then the moment we started to scatter,